Before we begin, please take a moment to review the disclaimer in the episode description. Remember, this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Now let's get started. Welcome to Wound Basics, the podcast that does exactly what it says on the tin, helps people to understand the basics of wound care. Today I'm joined by Tal Ellis. Tal has 40 years of experience as a healthcare practitioner, educator, researcher, executive and consultant, working across primary health, general practice and the aged care sectors. And in this episode, we'll be talking about pressure injuries. So let's begin by defining what pressure injuries are and why they are significant for healthcare workers to understand. So, Tal, what's a pressure injury?
It's a really interesting question because for a long time we've always thought that pressure injuries, by virtue of what we actually call them, are caused purely by pressure, so that when the internal part of the body, like a bone, is pressed through muscle, through skin and onto a hard surface and causes damage to the tissue. So that's typically what people have thought about pressure injuries. The reality is that that's not the only thing that pressure injuries are. They're actually way more complex than that. And without going into the whole scientific thing, pressure injuries are typically three different types of events that come together to cause damage to tissue that we then call a pressure injury. So, for example, if you can imagine sitting in a chair and your skin is being held up by the surface of the chair, but all the structures in your body are pushing downwards with force of gravity, that actually causes the blood vessels to get rolled and to get squished. And as a consequence, you end up cutting off the blood supply to the areas of the tissue where that squishing of the blood vessels is occurring. As a consequence, you end up with no oxygen. When you end up with no oxygen, the tissue starts to die and gets severely damaged. So that is what we call shear force. And so shear force actually plays a major role in the development of tissue damage that we typically associated with a pressure injury. The other part of it is, of course, friction. And we were talking in one of our other podcasts about incontinence-associated dermatitis, and that is a moisture damage on the skin. When friction occurs, you rub the skin, and as you rub the skin, it becomes more vulnerable. Then if you add moisture to that, you end up with skin which is very, very vulnerable, and it can actually start to cause lower tissue damage. In other words, it doesn't perform like it used to, so you can end up with a contribution towards a wound that we call a pressure injury. So let's think about pressure injuries as being in three parts. Firstly, there has to be some squishing between the internal structure and the external surface, like a chair. Secondly, there has to be some rolling and squishing of the blood vessels, which then stops the oxygen getting to that tissue and causes damage. And thirdly, there needs to be friction associated with between the skin and whatever surface that you're sitting on, and that friction in itself can cause damage, but that friction is also what causes the skin to stop where it is and allow those internal structures to roll down and squish those blood vessels.
I think you've explained that really well, because it is, as you say, more complicated than you first imagine. It is this combination of pressure, friction and shear. I often think of it as pressure and dragging, because dragging is something
that's
that
a really
I
good
think
way of saying
people actually understand. So it's like something that's being sat on and then dragged along at the same time. Obviously, there's something that is quite well established, that they are a problem in hospitals and aged care facilities. So why are pressure injuries so significant, and why do healthcare workers need to understand them?
Pressure injuries are not a new thing for human beings, and any time when we've become ill and laid down, we've actually seen them. In fact, one of the most fascinating things is the study of the mummified remains from Egypt, and actually where people have had to lay down for a long period of time, and before they get mummified, if you like, when they've been ill, they've actually found pressure injuries on that group of people.
Wow.
So this is nothing new. And so this is something that humans have been battling for a long period of time. Since the advent of what we would call modern hospitals, it's something that we really see and we really have identified as a particular phenomenon. We need to be super careful with it because they are a significant cause of additional illness. There's a word called morbidity, but we don't need to worry about that word. But it's additional illness. In a hospital setting, the problem with pressure injuries is not only that it causes that additional illness and they're painful and they increase your chances of getting infection, etc., but they significantly increase the length of stay for a person in a hospital. Anything up to, I think the average is about a 3-day increase in length of stay, but that's taking, every minor pressure injury and every major pressure injury and averaging it all out. In a residential aged care facility, obviously that's not going to change the length of stay, but what it significantly changes is the health span of that person. And there's been a lot of talk about, lifespan versus health span. Pressure injuries reduce the health span of a person.
So obviously certain people are more vulnerable to pressure injuries than others. So can you just very quickly give us the key risk factors or the things that might cause people to develop a pressure injury?
So the number one thing is immobility. If a person cannot turn or move themselves, they are at risk of a pressure injury. So that's the number one thing. So we've always got to look for people with altered mobility status, but particularly immobility. So that's one of the major things. The second thing to look for is people with changes in their tissue strength. Now, it depends on which books you read and which articles you read, but there's another way of putting that, and it's a person who is at nutritional deficit. So a person who's not eating well, if they're not taking in enough food, their muscle density changes, so their muscles become weak, and that group of people, even when they're still up and about, they actually become very vulnerable to pressure injury. So people who are immobile, people with nutritional changes, people with tissue density changes or muscle density changes are the major problems. There's another one that I always like to talk about that relates to looking after people in residential aged care, and that's the people who are suffering from repeated movement. So if you see people with Parkinson's disease, for example, where they're constantly moving their arms and feet, etc., that is a problem because that can lead to a friction event. So I think that we also need to be thinking about not only the immobile person, but the person who might be hypermobile and have a limb which doesn't have any great control. So I think those are the main groups that I would be identifying, and clearly immobility can mean a whole bunch of things. I mean, that can be immobile because you've got severe arthritis, or it could be that you're immobile because you're unconscious, so it varies across there, but immobility is the biggest.
Well, thanks for that really clear idea about looking for people who are immobile, because that makes it quite easy to identify the major set of people that are likely to get a pressure injury. And of course, there are many, many other factors. And this is a very high helicopter view on this podcast. So we're not going to go into every nook and cranny of what can cause a pressure injury. But what are the top line things that healthcare workers can do to actually help to prevent a pressure injury, Tal?
So I think first and foremost, let's identify the people who are at risk. There's lots of risk assessment scales. The Braden scale is typically used, Norton scale. There's various other types of scales that people can use. But understanding who is at risk allows you then to take certain actions. What do those actions look like? If a person is typically immobile, unconscious or whatever, then we have to take action to move that person. So that means regular and frequent repositioning of the person. Once upon a time, we used to talk about 2-hourly turns, etc. That's actually a piece of history that has no relevance in science whatsoever. And in fact, you need to be moving the person as often as required, and you identify that by looking at their skin, seeing where the red or the darker tissue spots are occurring, looking at how quickly they disappear, and ensuring that you move so that those things don't occur very frequently. The other thing is that we need to look very carefully at the surfaces that people are either lying on or sitting on, and making sure they're appropriate for their needs. So that this might mean that we need a proper redistribution type mattress. We might need an alternating air mattress where you've got cells in the mattress that inflate and deflate so that we're taking pressure on and off different areas. On a chair, we might need a fluidized seat. We might need a special kind of air seat with a little fingers of air. They call them Roho seats, etc. But there's lots of different types, and those are specially set up to actually reduce pressure. And then, of course, and I think it's really important that we don't forget this, that sheepskins went right out of favour, but there is a very good body of work that shows you that medical grade sheepskin, which conforms to a particular standard, is actually appropriate for what you would call a person who is at low risk of pressure injury but needs some help. So we can't throw that little baby out with the bathwater either.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember working in aged care many years ago, and they used to have sheepskin, and I think they put it through the washing machine at about 90 degrees, and it'd come out like a stiff piece of leather that wasn't really going to help anybody. But I think if things are the right grade and looked after properly in the sheepskin line, then they can actually have some utility. But what I really take away from what you just said there, Tal, is that it's about personalised care, isn't it? Which is something I do like to talk about quite a lot. And things like turning people really has to be determined by the risk factors that they're demonstrating, and support services need to be tailored to their needs.
This is absolutely right. I think the message that I'd really like to get out to people is that the notion that somehow 2 hourly turns is based in science is wrong. There's no science to 2 hourly turns. You need to move the person and reposition the person as frequently as is required by that person and their needs. There is no sort of like formula to this. You have to assess each individual. And I just wanted to also add that when we talk about repositioning, it doesn't necessarily involve gross movements of the person. Repositioning a person in a seat, for example, can mean putting a pillow under their leg, putting their foot up on a stool and putting their other foot somewhere down on the floor, and actually constantly making little changes and movement. Because if you think about how a person sits in a chair, no one ever sits completely. And that's because the body will make you move when it feels like it needs to actually get pressure off on a particular point. So we have to copy that. And when a person's in bed, you need to be making little movements frequently, and that's a lot safer than just saying, oh, we're not going to turn that person again for 2 hours now. That's actually an unsafe practice.
Well, that's good to know. Thanks for those tips. This episode of Wound Basics is brought to you by Smith & Nephew, shaping what's possible in wound care. Now, this is probably something that's not that easy to do in a podcast, because often we use visuals to explain the stages of pressure injuries. But could you very quickly skip over the stages of pressure injuries and just help our healthcare workers out there to be able to differentiate between them when they're looking at their people that they're looking after?
Sure. Well, if you look at all the manuals and stuff, they say there's 6 stages of pressure injury. So let's just start with the top one. So the first stage of a pressure injury is when you get a red spot on lighter coloured skin or a very dark spot on darker coloured skin, which actually stays there for more than 2 minutes after the pressure has been relieved. Or if you press it, doesn't go pale and then back to the darker colour. That's actually a stage 1 pressure injury. Stage 2 is when the top surface of the skin is scrubbed off and you can start to see a little bit of bleeding perhaps, so that you get the red spot or the dark spot which doesn't change colour, and you've got some scrubbing off of the skin and you can actually see some bleeding there. That would be called a stage 2 pressure injury.
Right.
Okay. A stage 3 pressure injury is where things start to get really dramatic. And this is where you've gone through the top layer of the skin, through the second layer of the skin, past that bleeding point, and now you're starting to expose even some of the surface layer of the fat that lies underneath the skin, and that typically is what we would call a stage 3. But a stage 3 pressure injury can actually go somewhat deeper than that, right, and can actually even go as far as the lining that sits over the top of the muscle, not into the muscle, we'll talk about that one in a minute, but can actually expose that lining, so the base of the wound can sometimes look a bit yellowy or fatty, or it can sometimes actually look like have a little white sort of look to it, which is quite tough and fibrous. So that would be a stage 3.
Got you.
So let's talk about a stage 4. This is where things get super nasty. So stage 4 is when you've gone through the top layer of the skin, the second layer of the skin, that fatty layer, and you've gone through those surfaces of that muscle, and now you're into the muscle, or you're even going further and you're going deep down, and you might be even exposing the bone. This is a really, really bad situation, particularly when there's bone exposed, because the person is then at very high risk of having an illness that goes through their body rather than it just being in the wound. So that's stage 4. Stage 5 is when you end up with a covering over the wound that you've actually got no idea what the depth of the pressure injury is. So if you're looking at it going, well, I can't tell whether that's a 1 or a 4 because there's this black covering or this dark grey covering or whatever over the top of it, that would be a stage 5. I hope that no one ever gets to see these stage anythings really, but least of all stage 4s and 5s. And stage 6 typically is when we suspect that there's deep tissue injury, but there's no major change to the skin yet except for this colour change. I do want to point out one thing about these things. When you look for this red spot or this darkened spot on a person, typically you're going to see it directly over the top of where there is a bone underneath. So if you think about your hip and you touch your hip and you can feel that pointy sort of bone at the side there, okay? If the pressure injury or the spot that you can see is right over that bone, that means that the main problem has been just pressure, okay? But if that spot has obviously been caused by that bone but sits away from that bone, that is a suspected deep tissue injury, and that is a very, very serious problem. And if you are a carer looking after people, you need to report any of these things, but please don't take another minute. As soon as you see a spot that is not near the bone, you need to report that straight away. It's a very, very serious problem.
Look, I think you've actually explained this really well. So stage 1 to 4, stage 1 is like a reddened area and varying amounts of tissue loss up to stage 4, which is a very deep ulcer. Then we have unstageable, which is basically where the view of the ulcer is obscured, probably by some kind of covering. Often it's called eschar, which can be just like a hard tortoise shell. It's over the top of the wound that's often dark purple or black. And then we have our suspected deep tissue injury, which often looks like this purpley bruise that it could be quite easy to just think, well, it's a purpley bruise, we bashed it on something. But when you look at the location, it's kind of co-located close to a bone. That's a real the alarm bells, isn't it, Tal?
It definitely is. I always try and reinforce that point, because sometimes, because it's not over a bone, people just sort of go, oh, that must be something else. But often that's the most severe one, and that's the one where you're going to get the biggest amount of tissue damage, because those things will definitely get bigger before they get better. And also I think it's really valuable for us just to remember that with the myriad of skin hues that we see in the people who we care for, that these pressure injuries do vary in their look. And so sometimes it's a matter of touching and feeling and making sure that you can't feel sort of an area that's become a bit boggy over the bones, etc. So sometimes you have to use not just your visuals, but you have to use your hands and try and sense what's going on with the tissue as well.
Absolutely. And would I be correct in supposing that the amount of time that you spend actually looking for pressure injuries probably relates to how much risk people have of getting one? So it's a bit like the turning, I would imagine, isn't it? The higher the risk the person is of having a pressure injury, the more often you would inspect them.
That's exactly right. But I think, it goes without saying that if you look at people who are typically in residential aged care, for example, that everyone who you would see there, most people have some sort of mobility change. Therefore, they're all at risk. And I think that we all need to be super vigilant for all people in our care. Whenever we can do a skin inspection, we should be doing it, in other words.
Absolutely. And we have another episode with Anne-Marie Dunk, who's a nurse, and she has really hit home about the importance of skin assessment and taking every opportunity to do it, because when you're providing daily care to people, there are lots of opportunities to see if their skin is needing a little bit of help. So what happens if we find a pressure injury, Tal?
Okay, so if you're a care worker or if you're a carer, say in community, etc., and you find one of these things, then, or you think that you found a pressure injury, don't hesitate to tell somebody who is able to take more action and more responsibility and change the care regime that person's getting. Right, so I'll just take the community out of the equation for a minute, and we'll just talk about residential aged care or hospitals, if you like. If you're a carer, you need to report that to a registered nurse or an enrolled nurse. That needs to be identified. Now, those people will then take action to change the surface that the person's on. They might change their mobility regimes, they might change their nutrition, they might change any number of different things. It may even require dressings, and so those types of things need to be put in place immediately. And it's also really, really important that we reassess the person once they have an injury to see, well, what's happened? Why have they got it? You know, do we need to change their risk profile? And if we change their risk profile and we enter that into their data, then we're able to make sure that they are provided with the aids, etc., that are required no matter what situation they find themselves in.
Absolutely. So I think that's really important that, you know, it's not that someone's made a mistake. So often circumstances have changed and people get pressure injuries for a variety of reasons. It's just important to escalate them to the right people so that the right measures can be put in place. So thanks very much for advising that to our listeners. Before we conclude, any final tips or recommendations that can help healthcare workers to care for pressure injuries?
Look, I think the most important take-homes from this are that pressure injuries are not just about pressure alone. A person can be moving a lot and still end up with a pressure injury. So it's about tissue damage which is caused by events that relate to how the skin comes into contact with the outside world, if you like. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's always super important to be constantly assessing and reassessing the people you're caring for, and taking, as Anne-Marie would no doubt say, taking every opportunity to assess skin, looking over those bony prominences, and making sure that if you see any changes that don't look, normal, if you like, let's face it, no real skin change is ever going to look normal, but if they don't look normal, you've got to make sure that that gets reported and that person then receives an immediate assessment for whatever's going on. Hopefully, it'll never be anything serious, but in the times that you find a pressure injury, you've actually helped that person enormously. Don't feel guilty about it. Just make sure that something gets done.
Tal, I love the way that you explain things in terms that anybody can understand, and you've really helped us to get around this world of pressure injuries, and we've got some key take-homes here about what to look for, how to prevent them, and also, importantly, how we must sound the alarm bells when we find something that doesn't look quite right. So, Tal Ellis, thanks so much for joining us in this week's episode of Wound Basics.
Great, thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Wound Basics. This show was brought to you by Smith & Nephew, shaping what's possible in wound care.